Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents A Kingdom's Cost, a historical novel of Scotland, by J.R. Tomlin, narrated by Gary Furlong. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up but with life itself. Declaration of Arbroath, Scotland, 1320. Prologue. Paris, September 1300. Putain de merde! Dazed, knocked to his knees by the merchant's blow, James Douglas leaned against the brick wall. He turned his head towards the River Seine. He might escape in that direction. The market square smelled of the stench of the river a few feet away. Blood ran down the back of James Douglas's neck. He grabbed the merchant's club as the man took another swing at him. "I am no thief! There was an accident!" The barrel-chested man ripped his weapon loose from James's hand. "Look at what you did!" The merchant kicked one of the pears that had fallen from his stall. James slid forward on his knees, trying to get far enough to make a dash for the river. His old deerhound, McAlpin, barked at the merchant's side. Snarling, he snapped at the man's leg. "Etienne, get this dog off me!" The merchant backed up a step. The merchant's friend ran up and kicked James's hound to send it flying. "Oh, St. Bridge, he's all I have left." James gathered his legs and flung himself at Etienne's knees. The man stumbled back. Across the market, McAlpin whined. The merchant's friend clouted James on the side of the head, making his ears ring. The man kicked him in the belly. He landed flat on the stone cobbles. His head bounced with a thud. A woman yelled that she needed to buy a melon for her mistress's dinner. "You almost made me miss a customer," the merchant said. He stomped a few feet away, grumbling. "They're in that basket, all fresh this morning." James clenched his teeth. He rolled once towards the river. "McAlpin, come," he called. A whine answered. Blood from the back of James's head plopped onto the cobbles. "Where do you think you're going?" the merchant shouted. "Knocking down my fruit, losing me money. You'll pay." The man ran towards him. James gave himself a desperate shove against the ground. As he rolled, the merchant's foot connected with his face. Blood gushed from his nose. Across the square his hound yelped. "Mange de la merde pute," the merchant growled. The ground disappeared from under James. He plunged into a dark cold as the Seine enveloped him. Rank water filled his nose and mouth. "You're going to die." He drifted off altogether. When he came back, it was quiet. He didn't know where he was except that he was lying face down in stinking mud. His hair lay in dripping black strings across his face. He dug his fingers into the muck. In a dim way, he wondered if he should be attending his father. He drifted off again. No, the letter said my Lord Father died in a dungeon. Nothing hurt. Shouldn't it hurt? Mayhap something had broken inside. He tried to move to find out. Dire mistake. His belly cramped and bent him like a bow. He gasped with the crushing agony of it. "Holy Virgin Mary, what did he do to me?" After a long time, the cramp passed, and he lay in the sunlight, too weak to do anything but pant in relief. He was too shattered to move. Thoughts drifted like blowing leaves, that he'd seen thieves die from such beatings, that mayhap he was so hurt he'd never be able to move. He lay still in the mud as the shadows lengthened in the waning afternoon. His face felt like a pillow stuffed with lumps of coal. He managed to breathe through his mouth, his nose clogged with blood. Ages passed. Eventually he lifted his head and took heart that his body didn't cramp. It wasn't getting worse. He knew from the practice yard that the best way to deal with being knocked flat was to take your time. The daylight had dimmed as shadows crawled towards the riverbank. A breeze chilled him and he shivered. Dark was good. It would hide him. Mayhap if he moved carefully, cautiously, he could get to his feet. He tried moving, dreading the pain. He moved his arms, his legs, tried to sit up. Couldn't do it. His muscles trembled. Lifting his head, he considered a spreading chestnut tree a few feet from the riverbank. He crept across the ground, crawling as far as the trunk and propped himself against it, panting. He rested there for a while, hurting but alive. Increasingly he thought he would stay that way. Strength returned, no longer a distant memory. He could stand if he tried. He grasped the rough trunk of the tree and pulled himself upright. Tottery, he held on to a drooping branch. It wasn't so bad. He ached all over, but he could move. Limping through the dark streets, he kept to the shadows against the buildings, using the slimy walls to stay on his feet. He hid in the dark whenever anyone walked his way. The half-moon hung high in the black velvet sky when he stood propped in the kitchen doorway of the Auberge du Grand Cerf. Heat from the fire in the hearth bathed his face. The serving girl, Isabeau, turned from the tune of wine with a full pitcher in her hand. Her mouth dropped open. Mon Dieu, your face. He held up a hand. Madame Jeannette! She yelled for her mistress. She banged the pitcher down on a table. He was trembling and feared he might spew all over the floor. Did they catch you hunting in the king's forest? He shook his head no, and pain shot through his head. The room revolved. Legs wobbling, he leaned against the wall. You're about to fall over. She grabbed him around the waist and lowered him to the ground. He wanted to tell her that he could stand, but the words didn't seem to come. Why are you bawling, girl? Madame Jeannette stalked in, hands on her ample hips, her skirts swishing. He's hurt. I'll get water and a cloth. She left him propped against the whitewashed wall as she leapt to her feet and scurried away. Someone beat him. Madame pursed her lips. I told you not to take up with Écossais. She pulled a cloth from her sleeve and dropped it next to James's hand. Don't get blood on my clean floor, boy. I'm sorry, madame, he mumbled around his stiff tongue. He wiped at the crusted blood on his face. She shook her head. Well, you've been a good boy, selling me meat for this stew pot. I won't complain as long as you don't make a mess. Isabeau squatted beside him. She dipped a cloth in water and, pushing his hand away, stroked the wet cloth across his face. Her breath caught with a little sob. Shh, she said, although he hadn't made a sound. He closed his eyes over grey mists that floated around him, sparkling with diamond-bright pin stars. Isabeau stroked his hair back. He would have liked to put his arms around her and rest his head on her small breasts as he had the times she'd let him lie with her. She'd said he was too young, even though she was only a little older, but he hadn't been. The memory helped. He was grateful she was there, that she would help him. He tried to tell her, but what came out was her name. Madame clicked her tongue against her teeth. I suppose he may have a cup of wine. Wine sizzled when Madame put a poker in the flagon to warm it. Even through his stuffed nose, he smelled the pinch of cloves she added. You don't want to get his blood on your gown, Isabeau said. Let me do it, madame. Isabeau pressed the cup to his lips and he took a sip. Who did this to you? I've never known you beaten in a fight. James shook his head, and rainbows sparkled behind his eyes, red and purple and green. It wasn't a fight. I knocked fruit off a stand. He hit me from behind. He shut his eyes to stop the sparks. The abbot gave me a letter from England that no more money would come from my schooling. The money my father sent with me is long since used. He said to go. They never even fed you proper. She made a sound in her throat. If there was money, they never used it for you. He wanted to tell her what else had been in the letter, but his head was too muzzy. He heard Madame talking about foolish boys who knock into a merchant's stall and cause damage, that it was his own fault he was hurt. But she took the cup and was refilling it. He had to agree with her that it was his own fault. He'd run crying for his father like a bairn, not watching where he was going. Anyway, said Madame, Why is there no more money? Your father's a baron, no? He's dead. The short sentence was all he could manage. Your wars with the English king, that Edward, he thinks to take part of our kingdom too. He gave a quick nod that made the room spin. He took everything. Let him stay, madame, Isabeau said. He can sleep by the fire. He's strong. He'll hunt and work. Madame shook her head. No, there's not work for another. My Pierre and you are enough. He'd cost too much to feed, still growing the way he is. After Isabeau finished cleaning his face and the split in the back of his head, Madame said he could rest for an hour or two beside the hearth. What am I going to do? As he tried to decide, the kitchen faded into grey half-sleep. He ran through the forest with a brace of rabbits, dodging the French king's huntsmen. If they caught him, they'd hang him of a certainty. A shout made him open his eyes, and he tried to decide if it was real. Voices came from the other side of the kitchen. Madame was saying again, no, he couldn't stay. Isabeau worrying that the merchant who'd beaten him might be looking for him. His face throbbed with heat. He moved his arms, stretched his legs. Stiff. Nothing was broken, even though his shoulder was too sore for him to use his left arm. He could manage. You don't look so bad, Madame said as he walked gingerly towards them. Thank you for helping me. He tried to speak clearly through his swollen mouth. I'll be on my way. Madame smiled, pleased that he wouldn't beg. Where will you go? You're too hurt. Isabeau looked at her mistress. Madame, let him stay for the night. I'll get back to Scotland somehow. His voice was muffled from his nose being stopped with blood. He gently felt the bridge. It was fat, but seemed straight. With his hawk nose, he had to be glad. If it were crooked as well, it would be hideous. Isabeau looked pained, but he knew she couldn't contradict her mistress. You don't have money for a horse, or a ship once you reach the sea. I can work my way. Once I reach Scotland... He narrowed his eyes. He'd have to think about that. What then when he got back? But it was his home. The only one he had, and somewhere was the king who had killed his father and stolen everything. Madame took out her purse. She put a single coin into James's hand. You've brought me many rabbits for the pot and that haunch of venison, and you'll fight the horrible English king, she sighed. Isabeau, get Pierre's old cloak. He can't take to the road without one. Isabeau turned and went to get it from the hallway. She sniffled, crying. James flexed his shoulders. Every inch of him hurt, but not as bad as it would tomorrow. At least he would be on the road and no one would know he didn't usually limp along like a beggar. He fastened the wool cloak around his shoulders. Merci, madame. Isabeau, je te reverrai un jour, je l'espère. But would he ever return? Only God knew. Isabeau kissed his cheek and he tried not to wince. Bonne chance, Madame said. He went back out into the night. He'd work his way to the sea, but first he had to find McAlpin. The thought that the dog might lay suffering, waiting for James to come help him, was like a rock in his belly. He'd been running blind when he'd smashed into the merchant's table. It took an hour of wandering in the dark to find the edge of the market where he'd been beaten. In a corner he stumbled over the hound's body. His legs were stretched out stiff, and his rough coat still sticky with blood. Devil take them, James said through gritted teeth. God damn into hell. For a long time James squatted next to the body. His father's steward had bound up the stairs, the pup in his hands, yelling that he had something for James. Years ago. A lifetime ago. James cradled his pounding head in his hands. He owed his father something. Not vengeance. There wasn't enough vengeance in the world for what the English had done. But he'd at least get back what they'd stolen. Somehow he'd do that. I swear it, he whispered. He couldn't even begin to think how. First he'd have to reach Scotland, a long weary walk to Calais, and then take a ship, working his way. Mayhap he could find Bishop Lamberton, who'd been his father's friend. James's eyes stung. He clenched his jaw and swallowed to suck back the tears. He wouldn't weep. Never again. Chapter 1. Stirling, Scotland, July 1304. Bishop William de Lamberton grasped his squire by his shoulder, pushing him towards the open doors at the end of the long, high-arched hall. James twisted out of Lamberton's grasp and whirled to face him. A youth of 16, dark-eyed and slender as a knife, James flushed with anger. "I won't swear fealty to him." Lamberton sighed. James was being unusually difficult. "Do you want your lands back? Your father's title?" James drew himself up. "You know I do. I must have them." He shoved shaking fingers through the black tumble of his hair. "My people need me, and it's where I belong. I've sworn to get back what was stolen from my father. A sacred oath." "Then you must bend a knee to King Edward." The lad stared past him to a hole that gaped in the far wall of Stirling Castle, captured only 2 days ago by the English king. The air reeked of smoke. Overhead beams were blackened from fire. "They tried to surrender, and the king wouldn't let them. He kept bombarding the castle with his siege engines, on and on." James's voice was ragged with anger. "I was in Berwick upon Tweed when the town was butchered. My father's page. I saw, my lord, from the walls of the castle, I saw what the English king did in the town. The thousands he put to the sword. The screams. All night and all the next day until there was no one left to scream. They starved him to death in a dungeon. How can I swear fealty to him?" Lamberton grabbed the lad's shoulders and gave him a shake. "You can, because you must." James's dark cheeks flamed red. "I can't! I want what they stole, but I can't." He tried to jerk free, but Lamberton clamped his hands on James's shoulders with a jerk. Never since returning from France, where his father had hidden him, had James defied Lamberton. But always underneath his obedience, James had a flame that burned, barely tamped down. Lamberton gave James another shake. "You're going to obey me." By the cross he understood the lad's anger. But against the stakes of freeing Scotland, he couldn't let that sway him. James having the power of his father's barony would be too useful not to try for. His whole body stiff and his wide mouth pressed into a grim line, James stared into the shadows before he bowed his head. "I'll do it, my lord, but only because you command me." But his voice was stiff with protest. "Then let us get this finished and behind us." Lamberton released him, trusting him to follow through the wide double doors of the great hall. The noise of men's voices and the colour of their splendid robes filled the room. Liveried servants hurried to place platters of food on the table that stretched the length of the hall. Under the stench of smoke, a scent of roast venison and onions drifted on the air. Around the table clustered men cutting dripping slices from a haunch of meat. At one end of the room, dressed in a rich velvet tunic with a leopard sewn in rubies on the front, King Edward Longshanks sat in a massive high-backed chair. Nearby Sir Robert de Clifford stood, still in dark armour, talking to the sharp-featured young Aymer Valence, Earl of Pembroke. A page poured wine into a goblet the king held. Even seated, Edward Longshanks towered over him. He was Longshanks indeed, even taller than William Wallace. Past his 60th year, Edward of England was as lean as a man 20 years younger, even handsome in a regal way. A short grey beard covered his cheeks and chin, framing a hawk nose, a stern mouth, and piercing blue eyes. They stabbed Lamberton with a suspicious look as he bowed deeply. The king motioned him forward. "Bishop Lamberton," he said in a voice that could carry across a battlefield. "What have you? I did not call you to my presence." Again, Lamberton bowed. At the best, he had to work to keep the king sweet. He was sure King Edward never forgot that the hated Wallace had raised him to the bishopric of St. Andrews. "I bring you my squire, who would swear fealty to you, sire. He'll serve your grace well as he has me." Lamberton stepped aside with another half-bow to the king, since James had lagged behind him. The lad had his eyes cast stubbornly down, but that might be as well. Best the king didn't see that wild look, and it made him appear humble enough even for Edward. "Your squire, eh?" Lamberton motioned James closer. "I ask you to grant him his inheritance as his father is dead, sire." "What's this inheritance he claims?" "The lands of Douglasdale, your grace." "Douglas?" The king jumped up from his seat. "You dare bring me the son of that traitor!" Edward Longshanks hurled the goblet at Lamberton. It hit his chest, wine soaking his robe and splashing across his face. In the sudden silence, Lamberton heard James gasp. Wine dripped down Lamberton's cheeks, but he dared not wipe them. "Sire, surely the sins of the father—" "Silence! Douglas died in my dungeon, and I am his heir." The king thrust his jaw towards Lord Robert Clifford. "I gifted the lands to one who has served me well. No traitor shall have them." "Surely, sire, the son is no traitor." The king's face empurpled with rage. "His father was always my enemy. Always. A friend of the outlaw William Wallace. I'll not have the boy. Get out! Out! Before he takes Wallace's place on the scaffold." Lamberton bowed deep before he turned. Blaming James for his father was harsh even for King Edward. He'd forgiven men who'd been in open rebellion, but now the only choice was to get the lad out of the king's sight. Another plan ruined, but a small one. With a hand on James's shoulder, Lamberton urged him towards the door, the lad with a ramrod's spine of indignation. No one spoke. No one else moved. Lamberton barely breathed until they reached the shattered stone rubble of the gatehouse. He took a breath. They'd live yet another day. James untied Lamberton's grey palfrey. His hands shook and his lips were white, they were so tightly clenched. For a moment Lamberton got James's full stare, black, wide-eyed and fuming. After a moment he removed his gaze to scatter it over the shadowy reach of the valley. Lamberton took the reins from his hand. "Don't take it so harsh, lad. I'll find a solution." He swung into the saddle. James gave a jerky nod. "I know you mean to, my lord." James jumped into his saddle, settled his feet in the stirrups and gathered the reins. "But I fear this I must solve for myself." Lamberton sighed, and then nodded down the rutted road towards town, its watchtowers and church spires dark against the gathering dusk. Stirling town had surrendered with no fight. Now it was full of English soldiery, but there were yet places a bishop could be secret. "I have someone to meet after dark." The city gate was open when they reached the bottom of the hill. Lamberton raised his hand in blessing as he rode past 4 drays lined up, loaded with barrels and bales of hay. A driver slipped a coin to one of the king's guards and was waved through the gate. The guard looked Lamberton over, raking him with a narrow-eyed stare. "Bishop Lamberton, returning from the king," Lamberton said. The man waved them past and turned back to the wagons. Lamberton kept to the edge of the street, nodding as James dropped his hand onto the hilt of his sword. Down the street a grey friar was praying loudly for the health of the English king. But passers-by paid him no more mind than a howling dog. The town milled with the usual crowd even in the growing murk, mostly soldiery in their mail with swords rattling, but also bakers' boys hawking their hot pies and breads, and whores leaning out of windows with their breasts half bared. He passed 2 men dragging a dead ass out of an alley by its rear legs, and an acrobat standing on his hands to the cheers of drunken English soldiers. but no one gave Lamberton and James a second look. Next to the high spire of the Church of the Holy Rood, Lamberton turned into an alley. In the deepening dusk, the way was dark. He dismounted and looped his reins to the rail of a walkway that ran along the building. At his nod, James swung off his mount. Lamberton motioned toward the street. "Check to be sure no one is in sight." James gave him a puzzled look, but tied his reins and walked towards the street, keeping in the dense shadow of the church's walkway. He paused and looked back over his shoulder, then went on. Near the street, James stopped, watching for a moment, and then returned the way he had come. "There's no one near, my lord." "Come." Lamberton shoved open the side door of the church. Their footfalls rang softly on the marble floor as he entered, James at his heels. The rich scent of incense hung in the air. He stopped and blinked, letting his eyes adjust. A man knelt alone at a side altar. Light from a row of candles reflected in his golden hair. "Deo gratia. He is here." Robert de Bruce, Earl of Carrick, looked over his shoulder. He rose, tall with a broad forehead and strong features, dressed in black silk and a black cloak. His blue eyes caught a gleam in the faint light. He took a step and grasped Lamberton's shoulders in a hard grip for a moment, then shook his head. Lamberton nodded towards the high altar and led the way past it and through a wooden door on the far side. He entered a square room with plain wooden walls, one wall covered with hooks where priestly vestments of white, purple, and red hung. Gold censers stood on a small table in the corner next to a stack of blank parchment and a stand of lit candles. He let out a small sigh of relief. "I wasn't sure that you'd come. I told you that I would. We must be ready." He paused to frown at James. Lamberton smiled slightly. "William Lahardy's lad, and my squire." He nodded to James. "Keep watch out with the door. See that we're not disturbed or overheard." James bowed quickly to both men and closed the door behind him. "You'll serve us well one day, Robert. Now," he motioned to the table. "I didn't care to have this prepared beforehand. I'll write the agreement now, but hear you. This will be treason that the leopard would never forgive. So put your mind to it, yea or nay. There will be no turning back." "Wallace agreed to give me his support, in spite of everything?" "He was wroth when you bent a knee to King England. But after Comyn betrayed him at Falkirk, withdrawing his chivalry from the battle, Wallace would do anything to keep that man from the throne. Yes, he gave me his oath." Bruce stared at a fist he clenched tight, seeming to study it. "What was I to do?" His voice was low and hoarse with emotion. "How could I lead a fight for a crown while my father lived, and I knew him too weak to hold it? When Edward had harried and pillaged my own lands to a smoking ruin, I had to buy time. That meant swearing to him." Lamberton sighed. "I told Wallace as much. Now that he's returned from France, he can see you had little choice. He's a fighter. You know strategy was never his weapon." "So be it." Bruce raised hot eyes to Lamberton's. "Write the words of our pact, and I'll put my seal to them." Lamberton dipped a quill in ink. "Mutual help at all times and against all persons without exception. By solemn oath before God." Bruce took the quill and scrawled his name. Beside it, Lamberton neatly penned his own. It was done. If King Edward saw this before they were ready to make their move, Lamberton knew nothing would save him from a dungeon or Robert de Bruce from a scaffold. Bruce frowned. "There's still John Comyn's claim to be dealt with. I doubt that he will agree to our bargain. Can you convince him, think you, with the enmity between the two of us?" Lamberton allowed himself a smile. "A prize as rich as that? Your earldom of Carrick, Annandale? To be the richest noble in Scotland for giving up a crown he would have to wrest from Edward Longshanks? That's temptation indeed." "If you hadn't stepped between us the day he dared to strike me." Bruce shook his head doubtfully. "I know the man's greed. I'll pick the right time and put it to him. He'll agree." As Robert de Bruce used a candle to drip hot wax onto the document and pressed his seal into it, Lamberton laid his hand on the man's shoulder. "The day will come, my friend. You will be the king who leads us to freedom. Chapter 2.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?